The first qualifying session of F1 2025 is in the books. It's a McLaren 1-2 on the grid for the Australian Grand Prix. But Edd Straw, how do you explain Max Verstappen being best of the rest but nearly 4 tenths off in the Red Bull?
Well, it says the McLaren's a very fast car, doesn't it? But it was very, very interesting to look at the way that McLaren delivered that pole position, because if you look at the speed traces, the lap time, get to turn 11, and actually Verstappen's at pretty much the same pace as Lando Norris, who got pole, and so Charles Leclerc for that matter. So what that tells us is that the McLaren is quick, but it's also looking after its tyres very, very well. You have to manage the tyres over a qualifying lap in Formula One. It's really, really hard on the tyres, that 9-10 sweep, and then you can get into all sorts of troubles if you get too much temperature into them. And I think the McLaren was just the one that had the least problem with this, and they just absolutely blasted everyone in those final few turns from turn 11 to the end of the lap.
Yeah, that explains why they blew away the competition. How did Lando Norris end up winning that intra-team battle? Less than a tenth between him and Oscar Piastri.
He always just looked to have that tiny, tiny edge, and he immediately built that advantage early in the lap, and it kind of ebbed and flowed. But come the end of the lap, we also saw he seemed to have his tyres in very fractionally better condition as well. So perhaps Norris versus Piastri, a small advantage in that regard, but very, very close between the two.
George Russell was quite pessimistic afterwards, saying that McLaren's so fast it can already switch focus to 2026 and still win both titles this year. He was a little bit further up in the Mercedes, but still fourth. A little bit of a hyperbole from George?
I think George probably needs to dial it back a bit. I mean, Mercedes obviously will feel they were a bit too far back. There are reasons why the McLaren may be a little bit, not flattered, but at the upper end of its advantage here. The drivers have talked about the car being a little bit tricky. Oscar Piastri says it's quick, but it bites. Now today, no real wind, really nice conditions. Andrea Stella, the team principal, was talking about that. Whereas in Bahrain, it was quite choppy. If you've got an aerodynamic sensitivity, those are the conditions where that shows. Whereas today, where it's calm, they don't. And it's not that the McLaren's going to suddenly become terrible if the conditions are a bit trickier, but there could be weaknesses lying in wait to be exploited on other days. The McLaren's a very strong car, but I don't think we can sign off for 2025 just yet.
Yeah, Russell said that everything about the front was pretty much as expected. McLaren being there, having the advantage, and then it being very tight behind. But perhaps what wasn't exactly expected was that it would be Verstappen in third. Red Bull had a difficult test. Verstappen didn't expect to fight for the win here. They didn't look happy after Friday practice. So how is it Verstappen in third? Is it more Max heroics?
Yeah, Max just being fantastically good at getting the most out of the car. He said the car actually felt all right, it just wasn't very quick. So that's probably where the Red Bull is.
Perhaps the most unexpected part of the lead battle is the fact that Ferrari wasn't part of it. Leclerc's the best of them in 7th place, more than 6 tenths of a second adrift. And we've got Mark Hughes to explain where that challenge fell apart.
Ferrari's challenge faded in qualifying, and they've been knocking on the door of McLaren pace throughout Friday, and they were a tenth off in Q1, a couple of tenths off in Q2, and ultimately 7 tenths off in Q3 to the dominant McLarens. So what's happened? I think two things. First of all, it's all in the last sector. It's all about rear tyre temperatures. So by the time Leclerc on his first Q3 lap gets to turn 11, he's within hundredths of Lando Norris. By the time he's done those next 3 corners, he's over 7 tenths away. And there's just no traction left. The rear tyres are beyond their critical temperature. Now, the C5 tyre around here is very marginal. It doesn't really have a strong enough core to support such a soft, grippy compound, especially through the high-speed corners. And the McLaren even was nibbling along at that problem, which is why you saw Piastri and Norris both have snappy little moments. But it managed just to keep out of that threshold. And the Ferrari spectacularly didn't. And also the Red Bull didn't, but its fall-off wasn't quite as spectacular in the last few corners. So that's where the pace went. And it looks as if we're looking for patterns to go through the season, it looks as if the more marginal the soft compound is for a circuit, then the bigger the advantage we might expect McLaren to have. It's just catching that just perfectly. So that's basically where Ferrari's challenge has gone this weekend.
Well, sticking with Ferrari quickly, Ed, let's talk a little bit about Leclerc versus Lewis Hamilton. First chance this weekend to directly compare them. Leclerc's had an edge all weekend, and Hamilton's probably about where we and he expected him to be, 2 tenths off. There's a sign of Hamilton getting closer to what the Ferrari needs, closer to the Leclerc style, which is sort of lifting off a little bit early, braking a little bit early, rolling more speed through the corner. But Leclerc just has a little bit of an edge when it comes to a bit of throttle brake overlap. That's a little bit of Leclerc magic that he can pull out. Turn 6 in particular here, that's paying dividends. Is Hamilton going to be okay, do you think, with this level of performance first time out the blocks for Ferrari? He'll probably be more concerned with that gap to the front than the one to Leclerc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all things considered, he's a racing driver. He'll want to be as quick as, if not quicker than his teammate. But I think he will see progress. It won't be like last year where it was at times like hitting his head against a brick wall. He knows he's got to spend some time familiarising himself with the car. Getting into those little technicalities, those last couple of tenths, is really, really hard work. And it could take half a season to do that. So I think a qualified success for him today.
Ferrari not being in the picture as expected meant that we've got a surprise row 3, Yuki Tsunoda and Alex Albon for Racing Bulls and Williams, respectively. Albon and Williams as a whole, Carlos Sainz a little bit off it in the end in qualifying. Williams very quick all weekend. Racing Bulls showing flashes of real speed. But where's that come from, Ed?
Well, yeah, Williams we expected. We had them as best of the midfield. Alex Albon's kind of proved that out. But what's been impressive about Racing Bulls is that car, every single day it runs, from one day to the next in testing, from one day to the next here, it just steadily gets that little bit better. Now, early on they had understeer problems, they chipped away at that. Now it just looks like a really good, nicely balanced car that's doing what it should do, giving the drivers confidence. And I think that's reflected in the time that Tsunoda pulled out of it. And it's not impossible Isaac Hadjar could have been in Q3 as well. He didn't quite get it completely together. So that's becoming a really nice, strong midfield car now.
There were 2 missing cars as well in that lead group, or 2 more missing cars in that lead group, because there wasn't one Mercedes and there wasn't one Red Bull. Liam Lawson and Kimi Antonelli were knocked out in Q1. Kimi Antonelli had a curb strike exit in turn 6, which damaged the floor, compromised him, and he couldn't go any faster. Did Liam Lawson have as much of an excuse for being out of Q1 on his Red Bull debut?
No, and he didn't really give himself such an excuse. He was fairly hard on himself. Racing drivers have to be, and I think that's one of the reasons he's in that team, because he can deal with these situations, be harder on himself and try and work at it. But basically, he's just struggling with the car. He doesn't have a great deal of confidence in it. He went off twice in Q1, and ultimately, yeah, that shouldn't be happening. He said that himself. That final lap he was on, he was probably going to be able to get through to Q2 with that, but he made that mistake at turn 13. As he said, I shouldn't be going off there. So really, really tough weekend for Lawson. First time in a Red Bull alongside Verstappen. First time he's driven at this Albert Park circuit. The only driver in the field who hasn't actually got some experience racing here. So definitely not what he wanted. But there's a few little excuses he can lean on.
Let's finish on a little bit of a weather warning for Sunday. Everyone's expecting rain. The last time we had a wet race, obviously Max Verstappen won from very far back. He's a lot higher up the grid this time. So should McLaren be worried?
I think there's a little bit of concern there. Certainly, if it's dry, McLaren should, all things being equal, win. Now, in the wet, it becomes a little bit more unpredictable. Andrea Stella, the team principal, said they don't really know how the car will work in the wet. Now, everyone will think back to Interlagos last year, where not only was Max Verstappen mega, but McLaren really struggled to get the tyres working. Now, they said, specifically Andrea Stella said, they've learned a few things from that Interlagos experience. And he said that with the air of someone who isn't too desperately worried about wet conditions. And he also said, we've also seen we've got a pretty good level of downforce, and that's your friend in the wet. So I would say it will complicate matters for McLaren, but they've got a few wet weather tricks up their sleeve. Verstappen will fancy his chances, and rightly so, but don't just discount McLaren because it's wet.